Man, everyone's drafting their fantasy football teams this week, and I feel like I've already lost.
Hey, are you tired of always losing your fantasy football league?
Yeah.
I mean, you can tell who a good fantasy football manager is, but you don't know how they do it.
Exactly. Yes.
Then I've got the sport for you. It's fantasy football. Fantasy football has all the mechanics of fantasy football, but you don't have to depend on those unpredictable athletes. You get to deal with the fantasy football managers you already know.
And there's no way this would damage my long-term friendships, would it?
Not at all. Why, let's look at a fantasy football draft already in progress.
For my first pick, I choose Freddie.
Ah, God, Freddie always wins his league.
Go ahead. Freddie's going to be in Europe for 3 weeks in November. There's no way he'll find dedicated Wi-Fi for his morning injury report checks.
Wow, they're intense.
They sure are. But don't let that stop you from putting your money on the line. Now you can join fantasy football.
Wait, fantasy football?
That's right, fantasy football. Put your money on the people putting their money on the crunchers of the numbers who are putting their money on the stats. Let's join a draft already in progress.
For the first pick, I choose Freddie.
Rookie move. I'm drafting Jenny. She's got a knowing look.
Go ahead. Freddie's going to be in Europe for 3 weeks in November.
Nailed it, mother lover!
I don't think I like this, actually.
Are you tired of fantasy football, Bill?
Another announcer? What is this?
Well, you might like fantasy football.
Okay, am I in hell right now?
Fantasy football gets you right in the action. It takes you from creep to athlete. Let's take a look at a draft already in progress.
For my first pick, I choose Freddie.
Rookie move. I'm drafting Jenny. She's got a knowing look.
Yes, my baby Jane. Put it all in for Daddy.
Go ahead. Freddie's going to be in Europe for 3 weeks in November.
Nailed it, mother lover!
Okay, this is really weird, dude.
Of course it is. It's fantasy football.
I think I'm just gonna stick with fantasy football.
Oh, Bill, you're already in.
We're watching you.
Right.
We're watching them watch you.
And I'm salivating over all the carnage.
It's fantasy football. It's getting creepy.